A world where survival means making impossible choices, one desperate mother faces the unthinkable. With starvation threatening both her newborn twins, she makes a decision that will shatter hearts throughout the kingdom, offering one child to the king himself. "I cannot care for them both, your majesty," she whispers, extending a tiny bundle toward the royal throne as shocked nobles look on. But when the mighty king, known for his iron will and cold heart, actually accepts the child, something extraordinary happens. A secret pain, buried for 5 years beneath the weight of a crown, suddenly resurfaces in his eyes. Why would a king, surrounded by wealth and power, accept a peasant's child? What mysterious connection links these two souls from opposite worlds? And what will happen when a mother's desperate love collides with a king's hidden grief in a confrontation that will change the kingdom forever? The great hall of the castle fell into an immediate, deafening silence as the heavy oak doors groaned open. The assembled nobles, with their silk garments and jeweled fingers, turned as one to stare at the intruder who dared interrupt the royal court. There, framed by the massive doorway, stood a peasant woman, her thin frame trembling, clutching 2 tiny bundles to her chest. The contrast couldn't have been more stark, her bare, mud-caked feet leaving dirty prints on the polished stone floor, her tattered dress hanging loosely on her malnourished body, while around her gleamed gold, silver, and the rich fabrics of nobility. The babies in her arms began to wail in unison, their cries echoing through the vaulted ceiling like a funeral lament. Some courtiers covered their ears, others wrinkled their noses at the intrusion of poverty into their perfumed world. The king himself, a man of 40 summers with a neatly trimmed beard streaked with gray, straightened on his gilded throne, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the armrests. "Who dares enter uninvited?" the royal chamberlain demanded, his voice cracking like a whip across the hall. But the woman continued her slow, painful walk forward, her eyes never leaving the king's face. The guards moved to intercept her, but something in her determined gaze made the king raise his hand to halt them. Perhaps it was curiosity, or maybe something deeper, something that stirred in his chest as he watched this mother clutching her children as though they were the only treasures she possessed. With each step, the whispers grew. Nobles leaned toward one another, hiding smirks behind jeweled hands. "The audacity," one countess murmured, "to bring squalling brats before his majesty." A young lord chuckled. Perhaps she expects the king to change their soiled cloths himself. When she reached the foot of the throne, her knees gave way not in a practiced curtsy, but in utter exhaustion. She knelt there, the twins crying louder still, their tiny fists punching the air. The woman's voice, when she finally spoke, was surprisingly clear, despite her visible fear. "Your Majesty," she began, her words cutting through the murmurs like a knife. "I cannot care for them both." The shock that rippled through the court was palpable. Some gasped openly, others exchanged glances of disbelief. The king himself seemed frozen, his eyes narrowing as he studied the woman's face, searching for madness or deceit. "What did you say?" he asked, his voice dangerously soft. The woman looked up, tears carving clean paths down her dirt-stained cheeks. "I cannot care for both my sons, your majesty. The winter was cruel. My husband died in your wars. I have no milk enough for 2 mouths, and my other children already go to sleep hungry." She paused, swallowing hard. "1 child might live well with me. 2 will surely perish slowly." Then, with trembling arms, she extended one of the bundles toward the king. "I beg you, sire, take this child as your own. Let him grow in your castle with food in his belly and a future ahead of him." The noblemen and women now openly scoffed and laughed. Some pointed at the audacious peasant, while others turned to observe their king's reaction to this preposterous request. But there was something in the woman's desperate plea that seemed to reach beyond the throne, beyond the crown, touching something human in everyone present. A question hung in the air. Why would a king, surrounded by wealth and power, ever accept a peasant child into his household? The air in the hall grew thick with tension. The king rose slowly from his throne, his crimson cloak flowing behind him like blood as he descended the marble steps. The courtiers held their breath. Would he call for the guards? Order her flogged for her impudence? The woman herself seemed to shrink, her body curving protectively around both infants as the monarch approached. But the king's eyes never left the child being offered to him. He stopped before the kneeling woman, towering over her like a mountain over a valley. The silence was so complete that one could hear the torches crackling in their sconces, the distant call of birds from the courtyard, even the soft breathing of the infants who had mysteriously fallen quiet at the king's approach. Then, to the astonishment of every soul present, King Alden extended his arms, not to strike, not to command, but to receive. His calloused hands, hands that had wielded sword and scepter, gently took the swaddled infant from the peasant mother. The hall erupted in shocked whispers. Ladies swooned, lords protested under their breath. The royal advisor stepped forward, his face contorted with concern, but the king silenced him with a single look. As the king cradled the small bundle, something changed in his expression. Those closest to the throne swore later that they saw tears gathering in their sovereign's eyes, tears he blinked away before they could fall. He looked down at the infant's face, and for a moment, something akin to recognition flickered across his features. "What is his name?" the king asked, his voice barely audible. "Edmund, Your Majesty," the woman replied, her own voice breaking. "After my father." The king nodded slowly, as though testing the name in his mind. "Edmund," he repeated. Then, raising his eyes to address the court, "This child will be raised within these walls. I accept the mother's gift." No one dared speak. The king's pronouncement hung in the air like a spell, binding them all to witness this extraordinary moment. But behind the king's sudden compassion lay something deeper, a shadow, a secret from his past that none present could fathom. Why would a powerful ruler accept a commoner's child? What pain or memory drove this unprecedented act of mercy? As the woman backed away, clutching her remaining son, relief and grief warred on her face in equal measure. She had saved one child from starvation, but at what cost to her heart? The king turned, the baby still in his arms, and walked back toward his private chambers rather than his throne. "Court is dismissed," he announced without looking back. That night, rumors spread like wildfire through the castle and beyond. Servants whispered in corridors, nobles debated in hushed tones over wine. No one understood the king's decision, but all sensed that this day had changed something fundamental in the realm. What no one knew, what no one could possibly know, was that the king's chambers held a secret that would explain everything. A secret that connected him to this peasant woman and her twins in ways that would shake the kingdom to its very foundations when revealed. The journey back to the village seemed endless to Alara. With each step, her heart grew heavier, the weight of her decision crushing her spirit like a millstone. The remaining twin, Aldrich, whimpered against her chest, perhaps already sensing his brother's absence. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the rutted dirt path, and Alara's own shadow appeared distorted and incomplete, just as she felt without her second child. As she approached the cluster of thatched cottages that formed the outskirts of the village, faces appeared in doorways and windows. News traveled faster than feet in these parts. They already knew. Of course they knew. The baker's wife, who had once shared bread with Alara during better days, quickly pulled her own children inside, as though Alara's actions might somehow be contagious. The blacksmith, hammering at his forge, paused mid-strike to stare, his judgment more searing than the red-hot iron he worked. "There she is," someone hissed, loud enough for her to hear. "The woman who sold her child to the king." "What kind of mother gives away her own flesh and blood?" another voice added, dripping with contempt. Alara kept her eyes fixed on the muddy path. What right had they to judge? None of them had buried a husband in winter. None had watched 3 older children grow gaunt with hunger, while 2 newborn mouths drained what little strength remained in her body. None had faced the impossible choice between watching both twins slowly starve or sacrificing one to save the other. A child darted in front of her, pointing and chanting, "Baby seller, baby seller," before his mother snatched him away, both fearful of and disgusted by Alara's presence. When she finally reached her humble dwelling, little more than a one-room hovel with a leaking roof, Alara collapsed onto the straw mattress that served as the family bed. Her 3 older children, who had been cared for by a neighbor, crowded around her, their eyes wide with confusion. "Where is Edmund?" asked 6-year-old Marta, her small fingers reaching toward the single bundle in her mother's arms. Ilara choked back a sob. "He has gone to live in the castle," she whispered, the words burning her throat like bile. "He will have food and warmth and fine clothes." "Will we see him again?" Thomas, her 8-year-old, asked. Ilara pulled her remaining children close, including the twin she still held. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice breaking. "I hope so." That night, as her children slept in a tangle of thin limbs and shared warmth, Ilara stared into the dying embers of their meager fire. Had she made an unforgivable mistake? Would Edmund grow up never knowing his true family, perhaps even despising the mother who had given him away? The doubt gnawed at her like a rat in the grain store, relentless and consuming. Meanwhile, within the stone walls of the royal castle, an entirely different scene unfolded. King Alden had retreated to his private chambers immediately after the shocking events in the throne room, the peasant's baby still cradled in his arms. He had dismissed all servants, even his most trusted attendant, waving them away with uncharacteristic agitation. Alone at last, the king placed the infant carefully on his own massive bed, watching with curious intensity as the child squirmed and blinked up at the ornate canopy overhead. Something strange flickered in the monarch's gaze, something between wonder and deep, unnamed pain. "Edmund," he murmured, testing the sound of the name again. His weathered finger gently traced the baby's cheek. So small, so innocent. When the child began to cry, the king didn't summon a wet nurse as protocol would dictate. Instead, he awkwardly attempted to soothe the infant himself, rocking and shushing as he'd never done before. When a knock came at his door, his advisor, no doubt, coming to question this unprecedented decision, the king barked an order to leave him be. Word of these peculiar actions spread quickly among the castle staff. Kitchen maids whispered to stable boys, who whispered to guards, who whispered to their captains. By midnight, the castle hummed with speculation. The king refuses to let the wet nurses near the child, a chambermaid confided to the steward as they passed in a darkened corridor. He's ordered a cradle placed beside his own bed. "I saw him myself," added a young page, eager to contribute to the gossip. He was holding the babe and staring at it as though he'd found a treasure chest full of gold. The queen had been dead for 5 years, and the king had shown no interest in remarrying, despite his counsel's persistent urgings to secure the succession. He had no legitimate children, or so everyone had believed. Now servants exchanged knowing glances. Perhaps the king's interest in this peasant child wasn't charity at all, but recognition. "Did you see how his eyes watered when he held the babe?" the head cook asked her assistants as they prepared the morning bread. "There's something there, mark my words." "The king hides something," agreed an elderly servant who had been at the castle since before Alden took the throne. "There's a shadow that follows him, has done for years. Something to do with the child, perhaps." These murmurs traversed the castle's winding passages like a silent plague, infecting every ear with curiosity and suspicion. Why would a king, known for his stern justice and unbending nature, suddenly welcome a commoner's infant into his most private spaces? Most perplexing of all was the king's expression when the child cried. Several servants swore they had glimpsed tears in the royal eyes, not tears of frustration or annoyance, but of profound, inexplicable grief. It was as though each wail from the baby's lips reopened an old wound in the king's heart. In the village, Ilara struggled with her own torment. As dawn broke, Aldrich began to wail with hunger. She offered her breast, but the milk came slow and thin. Her body, weakened by poor nutrition and the strain of twin birth, was failing both her and her remaining son. The crushing weight of guilt pressed upon her chest. Had she condemned one son only to lose the other anyway? The cruel whispers continued to follow her through the village. Women who had once shared remedies for colic or traded vegetables from their gardens now crossed to the other side of the muddy street to avoid her. Men who had once nodded respectfully to the widow of a fallen soldier now spat on the ground as she passed. "How could she?" they asked one another. "A mother is supposed to protect her children, not trade them away like market goods." None saw how her hands trembled when she drew water from the well. None noticed how she gave most of her own meager portion of food to her older children, hoping to squeeze more milk from her depleted body for Aldrich. None witnessed how she wept silently each night, her arms aching for the twin who was no longer there. As Alara laid Aldrich in his rough wooden cradle that evening, a terrible thought seized her heart. What if the king had not truly wanted Edmund? What if he had merely been putting on a show of royal mercy before the court? What if, even now, her abandoned son was being treated as less than the dogs in the royal kennels? Or worse, what if Edmund thrived? What if he grew fat on rich milk, was dressed in silks, learned to read and write and wield a sword? What if he became more prince than peasant? Would he ever know of his humble beginnings, of his twin, of the mother who had been forced to choose? As darkness fell over both castle and village, two souls lay awake, a king and a peasant woman, both haunted by choices made and secrets kept, both wondering if they would ever see the consequences of this fateful day unfold. 7 days had passed since the peasant woman's shocking appearance in the throne room. 7 days of whispers and speculation that rippled through the castle like waves on a disturbed pond. The initial shock had given way to a persistent curiosity that consumed the royal household from the highest lords to the lowest scullery maids. King Alden's behavior only fueled these rumors, as he had withdrawn almost entirely from court affairs, delegating his duties to his increasingly concerned advisors. Lady Imogen, daughter of the Duke of Westmere and one of the Queen's former ladies-in-waiting, had remained at court even after the Queen's death years ago. Her position afforded her privileges few others enjoyed, including relatively free access to the royal apartments. She had known King Alden since before he wore the crown, when he was merely a prince with a quick laugh and eyes unclouded by whatever shadows now haunted him. On this particular morning, Lady Imogen made a decision. Concern for the king, and if she were honest with herself, burning curiosity about the peasant baby, drove her to breach protocol. She approached the king's private chambers without sending a page ahead to announce her. The two guards stationed outside exchanged uncertain glances as she approached. "His Majesty has requested no visitors," the taller of the two stated, his voice firm but respectful. Lady Imogen drew herself up to her full height, arranging her features into the impassive mask of nobility she had perfected over decades at court. "I am not a visitor, Sir Roland. I have urgent matters regarding the Westmere estates that require immediate attention." The lie slipped easily from her lips, wrapped in the confidence of her station. The guards hesitated, caught between contradicting orders and challenging a high-born lady. In that moment of indecision, Imogen pushed past them, rapping her knuckles against the heavy oak door once before pushing it open. She stepped inside before either guard could stop her, closing the door firmly behind her. What she saw stopped her cold. The mighty King Alden, conqueror of the Northern Rebellion, the man who had executed 3 traitors with his own sword at the Battle of Blackwater Pass, was sitting in a pool of morning sunlight beside the window. In his arms he cradled the peasant baby, speaking to it in hushed tones that Imogen couldn't quite catch. But it wasn't this tender scene alone that caused her breath to catch in her throat. It was the king's expression. His normally stern face had softened, the hard lines around his mouth relaxed, and in his eyes shone a vulnerability she hadn't seen since before the tragedy. The king looked up, his moment of unguarded emotion instantly replaced by a flash of anger. "Lady Imogen, I do not recall summoning you." Imogen cursed deeply, buying herself a moment to collect her thoughts. "Forgive me, Your Majesty. I was concerned." "The council meets this afternoon, and there are matters requiring your attention that cannot wait." The king's jaw tightened. "As you can see, I am occupied." He made no move to hide the child or call for a nurse to take it away, which struck Imogen as significant. Instead, he adjusted the small bundle in his arms, supporting the baby's head with a gentleness that seemed at odds with his warrior's hands. "The child appears to be thriving in your care," Imogen ventured, taking a step closer. "Though perhaps a wet nurse. He has been fed," Alden cut her off. "I have arranged for everything he needs." Imogen noted the personal nature of his words. Not the child, but he. Not "I have ordered," but I have arranged. The king was personally involved in a way that defied explanation, at least any explanation that would satisfy the court gossips. May I? She asked, gesturing toward the infant. After a moment's hesitation, the king nodded. Imogen approached and peered down at the baby's face. A pair of curious blue eyes stared back at her. All babies had blue eyes, of course, but something about this child's gaze seemed familiar. He has a strong look about him, she said carefully. He will grow into a fine young man, I suspect. Yes, the king agreed, his voice unexpectedly thick with emotion. He will. An awkward silence fell between them, broken only by the soft cooing sounds from the infant. Imogen, sensing that she had intruded on something deeply personal, began to back away. I shall inform the council that you are indisposed, Your Majesty. Perhaps tomorrow. Thank you, Lady Imogen, the king said, his tone making it clear the audience was over. She curtsied again and turned to leave. As she did, her silk skirt caught on the edge of a small wooden table, nearly toppling it. Instinctively, she reached out to steady it, and that's when she saw it. Partially hidden beneath a velvet cloth, the corner of a framed portrait peeked out. The king hadn't noticed, his attention still focused on the child. Imogen's fingers itched with curiosity. With a movement she hoped appeared natural, she adjusted the cloth as if tidying it, allowing herself a glimpse of what lay beneath. It was a portrait, small enough to hold in one hand, exquisitely painted in the detailed style favored by court artists. It showed a woman with auburn hair and a gentle smile, her arms cradling a newborn wrapped in a cloth of royal blue. The woman was undoubtedly Queen Eleonora, the king's late wife. But the child? Imogen had never seen this portrait before, and she had been present throughout the queen's brief marriage to Alden. To her knowledge, the union had been childless, the source of much concern for the council and the kingdom's future. Yet here was evidence that contradicted everything she thought she knew. Imogen withdrew her hand as though burned, her mind racing with implications. She managed to compose herself before turning back to the king. "Until tomorrow, Your Majesty," she murmured, then fled the chamber before her face could betray her discovery. Once safely away from the royal apartments, Imogen leaned against a stone wall, her heart pounding. The portrait could mean only one thing: the queen had borne a child. But where was that child now? No royal heir had ever been presented to the court or the kingdom. Had the infant died? Was that the source of the king's deep and abiding grief, the shadow that had darkened his reign these past years? And if so, what connection did that lost child have to this peasant baby the king now cherished? By midday, whispers of Lady Imogen's unauthorized visit to the king's chambers had spread throughout the castle. By evening, exaggerated accounts claimed she had discovered the king weeping over the peasant child. By nightfall, the most sensational rumor yet had taken hold: that King Alden had lost a son years ago, a secret heir whose existence had been concealed from the kingdom. They say the queen died in childbirth, the head cook told her wide-eyed kitchen staff, and the babe soon after. The king was so distraught he ordered all evidence destroyed, all witnesses silenced. "That can't be true," a young serving boy protested. "Someone would have known. Someone would have spoken out." "And risk the king's wrath?" countered an older servant. "I've served in this castle for 30 years. There was a time, just after the queen's death, when the king would fly into a rage at the slightest mention of her name. Guards were doubled on his chambers. Strange men came and went in the night. For weeks, he spoke to no one save his most trusted advisor. Meanwhile, in the village below the castle, Ilara fought her own battle against mounting hostility. Women crossed themselves when she passed, as if to ward off evil. No one would trade with her, forcing her to walk twice as far to the neighboring village for essentials. Her older children returned from the fields with bruises and tears, bullied by former friends whose parents had forbidden them to associate with the children of a woman who sells her babies. Aldrich grew weaker by the day. Without proper nourishment, Ilara's milk was diminishing, and the tiny boy seemed to fade before her eyes. His cries had grown feebler, his skin taking on a worrying pallor. In desperation, Ilara had begun to wonder, had she chosen wrong? Should she have given Aldrich to the king instead, or worse, Had she condemned both twins by separating them? As she laid her remaining son in his cradle that night, she whispered, "Is your brother now wrapped in silk while you shiver in rags? Does he drink from a silver cup while your lips go dry? Does he sleep in a feather bed while you lie on straw?" The questions tormented her, each one a thorn in her already bleeding heart. She lifted her eyes to the distant castle, its towers silhouetted against the night sky, lights glowing in scattered windows like earthbound stars. Somewhere within those walls was her son, her Edmund. Was he crying for her? Had he already forgotten the sound of her voice, the scent of her body? Or was he thriving in his new life, already becoming someone, something else entirely? "Will you grow up a prince?" she whispered, "never knowing you were born a pauper? Will you ever learn of your brother, your mirror image left behind? And if our paths cross again, will you look upon me as a stranger? Or worse, as a mother who abandoned you?" The thought was unbearable. In that moment, Ilara made a decision that would set in motion events none could foresee. Tomorrow, she would find a way back into the castle. She would see her son once more, even if it meant risking everything: her reputation, her freedom, perhaps even her life. The great hall blazed with torchlight, the flames reflecting off golden plates and jeweled goblets that lined the massive oak table. Tonight marked the Feast of Harvest's End, a celebration that had been observed in the kingdom for hundreds of years. Even in times of strife, the tradition remained unbroken, a reminder that life continued its cycles regardless of human troubles. King Alden sat at the head of the table, his crown gleaming in the firelight, his expression remote and thoughtful. It was the first time in nearly 2 weeks that he had appeared at a public function, and the court scrutinized him with barely concealed curiosity. The rumors about the peasant baby had grown wilder with each passing day. Some claimed the king had already named the child his heir. Others insisted he was performing some bizarre penance for past sins. What no one knew was that Edmund slept just 2 chambers away from the banquet hall, attended by the king's most trusted nursemaid, with guards posted outside the door. Even now, as lords and ladies raised toasts and musicians played merry tunes, the king's thoughts strayed repeatedly to the small room where the infant lay. Lord Cedric, a powerful noble whose lands bordered the eastern frontiers, had been watching the king with calculating eyes throughout the evening. His ambition was well known, his loyalty questionable. As the third course was cleared away, a succulent roast swan presented on a bed of caramelized apples, Cedric raised his goblet, the ruby-colored wine sloshing dangerously close to the rim. "A toast," he announced, his voice carrying easily over the assembled guests, who fell silent in anticipation, "to our gracious sovereign whose compassion knows no bounds." Something in his tone caused a ripple of tension to spread through the hall. Lady Imogen, seated several places down, straightened in her chair, sensing danger. "Indeed," Cedric continued, his lips curling into what could barely pass for a smile, "it seems His Majesty's heart has grown so tender that the castle has become not just a seat of power but a nursery for peasant offspring." The hall fell utterly silent. Even the servants froze in place, pitchers and platters suspended in mid-air. All eyes darted between Lord Cedric and the king, waiting for the inevitable explosion of royal fury. King Alden sat motionless, his face a mask of rigid control. But those closest to him, Lady Imogen among them, noticed how his right hand moved slowly to his chest, coming to rest over his heart. They saw the careful, deliberate way he inhaled, as if each breath required conscious effort. In his eyes burned not just anger, but something deeper and more dangerous, a contained inferno of grief and rage intertwined. It was a look few had seen and lived to speak of afterward. "Lord Cedric," the king finally spoke, his voice deceptively quiet, "you forget yourself." Cedric, emboldened perhaps by wine or by his own reckless ambition, gave a mocking half-bow. "Forgive me, Your Majesty. I merely observe that the throne room is not a place for swaddling clothes, nor is a king's duty to rock cradles. Some might wonder if such distractions serve the realm well." The implication was clear. The king's interest in the peasant child was undermining his authority, making him appear weak before his nobles. It was a dangerous accusation, especially when made publicly. Several council members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The master of coin busied himself with cutting a piece of meat that had already been reduced to tiny morsels. The aging commander of the king's guard rested his hand meaningfully on the pommel of his sword. King Alden rose slowly to his feet, his tall frame casting a long shadow across the table. The silence in the hall grew thicker, almost suffocating. "The day I require Lord Cedric's counsel on what duties befit a king," he said, each word precise and cutting as a blade, "is the day I surrender my crown and retire to a monastery." A few nervous titters broke out among the younger courtiers, quickly stifled as the king continued. "Until such time, I suggest you concern yourself with your own estates, which I hear are in some disarray following the summer floods. Perhaps less wine and more attentiveness to your ledgers would serve you better than speculation about royal matters beyond your understanding." The public rebuke was scathing. Lord Cedric's face darkened, first with embarrassment, then with poorly concealed rage. He opened his mouth as if to retort, thought better of it, and instead drained his wine cup in a single gulp, slamming it down with enough force to crack the fine crystal. The feast resumed with forced gaiety, musicians playing louder than before to cover the lingering tension. But something had shifted in the atmosphere of the court. The king's defense of the peasant child, indirect though it was, had confirmed to many that this was no mere passing fancy or act of charity. Whatever bond existed between Alden and the infant, it was strong enough for the king to risk alienating a powerful noble. Later that night, when the feasting was done and the guests had retired to their chambers, King Alden returned to his private apartments alone. He dismissed his attendants with a curt wave, wanting solitude. The events of the evening had reopened old wounds, bringing to the surface memories he had long tried to bury. Once certain he was unobserved, the king moved to a particular stone in the wall beside the hearth. It appeared no different from the others, but when pressed in a specific way, it slid back to reveal a small hidden compartment. From within, he withdrew a wooden box, simple and unadorned, nothing like the jeweled caskets that held the crown jewels and royal seals. Alden carried it to his table and opened it with hands that trembled slightly. Inside lay a piece of cloth, once white but now yellowed with age, stained with a dark brown substance that time had not completely faded. Blood. Royal blood. Wrapped within the cloth was a small golden bracelet, sized to fit an infant's wrist. It bore the royal crest, the same symbol that adorned the king's own signet ring. With infinite gentleness, he lifted it out, the metal catching the firelight as it dangled from his fingers. 5 years, he whispered to the empty room. 5 years, and the pain remains as fresh as yesterday. The memory overwhelmed him. The queen's difficult labor, her screams echoing through the castle corridors. The midwives' grim faces as they hurried in and out with bloodied cloths. The tiny, perfect son placed briefly in his arms, his eyes still closed, his tiny fists clenched as if ready to fight the world. And then, horror as the infant gasped, struggled, and grew still, the queen following soon after, her life bleeding away despite the court physician's desperate efforts. Father and son, they had said, to be buried together. In his darkest hours after their deaths, Alden had considered following them. Only duty to his kingdom had kept him tethered to life. That, and a consuming rage that had no proper target. He had ordered all evidence of the child's existence removed from the castle. No portraits, no nursery, no tiny clothes laid ready in anticipation. Nothing to remind him of what he had lost. Nothing except this small bracelet, which he had secretly removed from his son's wrist before the burial. It was his only tangible connection to the boy who should have been his heir, who should have grown to manhood under his guidance, who should have stood ready to take the crown when Alden's time came to pass it on. And now there was Edmund, a peasant's son, yes, but something about the child had reached through the armor of grief Alden had built around himself. Perhaps it was merely timing, or perhaps it was something in the infant's eyes that reminded him of possibilities lost. Whatever the reason, he had acted on impulse when he accepted the baby, driven by an emotion he couldn't name. Was it madness? A desperate attempt to fill an unfillable void, or something more? A second chance granted by whatever gods watched over kings and kingdoms? The king returned the bracelet to its cloth wrapping and placed it carefully back in the box, which he then sealed once more in its hiding place. As he did, he became aware of a presence behind him. Turning sharply, he found the royal nursemaid standing in the doorway that connected to the smaller chamber where Edmund slept. "Forgive me, Your Majesty," she said, curtsying deeply. "The babe grows restless. I thought perhaps—" She hesitated, uncertain how to phrase her concern to the king. Alden nodded. "I will come," he said simply. As he moved toward the infant's chamber, a new thought took root in his mind. Lord Cedric's challenge at the feast had been more than mere impudence. It was the first public sign of resistance to his interest in the child. There would be more challenges to come, more questions, more threats, both veiled and direct. If he truly meant to keep this child close, to raise him within the castle walls, he would need to secure his position. The council would press ever harder for him to remarry, to produce a legitimate heir. The nobles would resist any suggestion that a peasant's child might receive royal favor. And somewhere out there was a mother who had given up her son once, but who might yet change her mind. The king reached the cradle where Edmund lay squirming, his tiny face scrunched in displeasure. Gently, Alden lifted him, cradling the small body against his chest as he had done with his own son for those few precious moments 5 years ago. "Rest easy, little one," he murmured. "I will protect you, whatever comes." But even as he made this promise, King Alden knew that darker days lay ahead. Forces were already aligning against them both, forces that would test his resolve and perhaps the very foundations of his reign. The first pale fingers of dawn had barely touched the eastern sky when Alara began her journey to the castle. She had risen before the cock's crow, nursing Aldrich one final time, before bundling him securely against her chest. The infant was alarmingly light in her arms, his once plump cheeks now hollow, his cries grown feeble. In the dim light of their hovel, she had studied his tiny face, memorizing every feature as if it might be the last time. "Be strong today, my little one," she had whispered, pressing her lips to his forehead. "Today we fight for your brother." Her 3 older children still slept on their shared pallet, unaware of their mother's desperate plan. She had left them a small pot of thin porridge and instructions with their elderly neighbor to watch over them until her return, if she returned. The thought sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the morning mist that clung to the fields. The journey to the castle took twice as long with her weakened body and precious burden. Each step felt like walking through deep mud, her legs leaden with exhaustion and fear. Yet determination drove her forward. She had spent days gathering scraps of information from passing traders and servants returning to the village. Any news of Edmund and the king? The rumors were conflicting, disjointed, but one thread remained consistent. The king kept the child close, treating him with unexpected tenderness. But for how long? Royal whims were as changeable as spring weather. Today, Edmund might sleep in silken sheets. Tomorrow he could be forgotten, handed off to indifferent servants, or, worse, discarded entirely when the novelty wore thin. As the castle loomed larger before her, Alara rehearsed what she would say. Not begging this time. No, she had humbled herself once already. This time she would demand, mother to father, human to human. She would reclaim what was hers by right of blood and birth. The massive outer gates were already open for the day's business, farmers bringing produce, merchants delivering goods, petitioners seeking justice. Ilara slipped through with a group of kitchen servants returning from the village, her rough homespun dress and head covering drawing no special attention. But as she approached the inner bailey, her luck ran out. "You there, woman?" A guard stepped into her path, his hand resting meaningfully on his sword hilt. "State your business." Alara clutched Aldrich tighter, feeling his small heart fluttering against her own. "I must see the king," she said, surprised by the steadiness in her voice. The guard snorted. "The king doesn't receive peasants without appointment. Take your troubles to the steward's office like everyone else. He will see me." Alara took a step forward, her eyes never leaving the guard's face. "Tell him the mother of Edmund seeks audience." Something in her tone, perhaps the unmistakable note of maternal ferocity, gave the guard pause. His eyes narrowed as he studied her more carefully, recognition dawning slowly. "You're her," he said finally. The woman who... Yes, Ilara cut him off. And I must see the king. Now. The guard hesitated, clearly weighing his options. Turning her away would be simplest. Yet if she truly was who she claimed, and if the rumors about the king's attachment to the child were true, denying her might earn royal displeasure. Wait here, he ordered finally, signaling to a second guard to keep watch over her. Ilara stood motionless as the minutes stretched painfully. Around her, the castle's morning routine continued, servants hurrying about their tasks, merchants unloading wares, horses being led to and from the stables. No one paid any particular attention to the thin woman with a baby, just another petitioner seeking some favor or justice. Finally, the guard returned with a captain of the royal guard, a tall man with a graying beard and hard eyes that had seen too many battles. Come with me, the captain said without preamble, and understand this. Any sudden movements, any disturbance, and you'll be removed immediately. Ilara nodded, her throat suddenly too dry for words. She followed the captain across the inner courtyard and through a smaller entrance than the grand doors she had used on her previous visit. They wound through narrow stone corridors, up a spiraling staircase, and finally into a wide hallway lined with tapestries depicting hunting scenes and ancient battles. Two guards flanked an ornate door at the end of the hallway. They straightened at the captain's approach, their eyes widening slightly as they took in Ilara and her child. The king is within, the captain told her. He has agreed to see you, but be warned, his patience is not infinite. With that, he knocked firmly on the door, opened it without waiting for a response, and announced in a formal tone, The woman from the village, your majesty, as you requested. Ilara stepped into a chamber more magnificent than any she had ever seen or imagined. Sunlight streamed through stained glass windows, casting jewel-toned patterns across a floor of polished stone. Tapestries more vivid and detailed than those in the hallway adorned the walls, depicting scenes from the kingdom's history. A fire crackled in a hearth large enough to roast an entire ox. And there, standing before that hearth, was King Alden. He wore no crown today, dressed instead in a simple tunic of dark blue velvet with the royal crest embroidered in silver thread. He looked younger without his crown, though no less imposing. For a long moment, neither spoke. The king studied her with an intensity that made Ilara's skin prickle, while she searched desperately for any sign of her son. Then she saw it, a small cradle near the king's writing desk, partially hidden from her view by an ornate screen. Without thinking of protocol or consequence, she strode toward it, need overriding caution. Stop, the king commanded, his voice like the crack of a whip. Ilara froze mid-step, Aldrich squirming against her chest as if sensing her sudden tension. You dare enter my private chambers and move unbidden? The king's voice was dangerously soft. Ilara sank into a deep curtsy, not from respect, but to buy herself a moment to collect her courage. When she straightened, her voice rang clear across the chamber. Majesty, I have come for my son. The words hung in the air between them, a challenge more direct than any the king had faced on the battlefield. Your son, he repeated, his tone unreadable. The child you freely gave away before witnesses. I gave him to you believing he would have a better life, Ilara countered, taking another step forward despite herself. But now my heart cannot bear it. I cannot live divided. Both my sons need their mother, and each needs his brother. As if to emphasize her point, Aldrich began to cry, a thin, reedy sound that spoke of hunger and distress. Almost simultaneously, a similar cry rose from behind the screen, as if Edmund sensed his twin's presence and answered his call. The king's expression changed at the sound, something like pain flickering in his eyes. He moved to the cradle and lifted Edmund with surprising gentleness, cradling the infant against his broad chest in a gesture that seemed practiced, natural. Look at him, the king said, turning so Ilara could see her son clearly for the first time in weeks. Does he look ill-treated, neglected? Indeed, Edmund appeared to be thriving. His cheeks were fuller than when she had last held him, his eyes brighter, his small body wrapped in a blanket of soft wool embroidered with golden thread. The contrast with Aldrich, thin, pale, clothed in rough homespun, was stark and painful. "He looks well, Majesty," Ilara admitted, her voice breaking. "Better than well, but he is still my son, born of my body, brother to this child I still carry." The court watched in utter silence, the tension so thick it seemed to press against the walls of the great hall. Every eye moved between the peasant woman standing defiantly before the throne and the king who held her child. Some nobles wore expressions of distaste at this unseemly scene. Others showed reluctant fascination. A few, particularly the women, revealed glimpses of sympathy for the mother's plight. The king looked down at Edmund, then across at Aldrich. His gaze lingered on the second twin, taking in his pitiful condition with a frown that deepened the lines around his mouth. "You claim you cannot live divided," he said finally, his voice carrying to every corner of the silent hall. "Yet you would divide these brothers? Take one and leave the other? What kind of choice is that?" Ilara felt tears spill down her cheeks, hot and shameful. "A mother's impossible choice, Majesty. I have 3 other children at home, already half starved. I cannot feed 2 more mouths when my milk runs dry from hunger." She took a deep, shuddering breath. "But I have realized I would rather all of us starve together than live with this wound in my heart." A murmur ran through the assembled court at her bold words. No one spoke to the king this way, with raw emotion instead of carefully crafted courtly speech. It was as if the normal rules that governed interaction between peasant and sovereign had been temporarily suspended, replaced by the more primal laws of motherhood and its fierce devotion. The king's next words would determine everything: justice or cruelty, compassion or cold royal prerogative. The entire court seemed to hold its breath, waiting. The silence in the great hall stretched to breaking point. Every breath seemed amplified, every rustle of fabric a disturbance in the heavy air. King Alden stood motionless, Edmund still cradled against his chest, his eyes fixed on Ilara and her weakened twin. The conflict etched across his features was unlike anything the court had witnessed before, not the measured deliberation of a monarch weighing matters of state, but something raw and deeply personal. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that commanded complete attention. "I have already lost a child." The words fell like stones into still water, sending ripples of shock through the assembled nobles. Lady Imogen gasped audibly, her hand flying to her throat. Lord Cedric narrowed his eyes, suddenly alert like a predator scenting blood. The royal advisors exchanged alarmed glances, clearly unprepared for this revelation. "I have already lost a child," the king repeated, louder now, his gaze sweeping across the stunned faces of his court. "And I will not lose another." Ilara's heart sank. Was this his final decision? Would he keep Edmund and send her away with only Aldrich, condemning her to a life half-lived, forever mourning the son beyond her reach? But the king wasn't finished. 5 years ago, he continued, each word seeming to cost him great effort, "the queen gave birth to our son, our only son. He lived for mere hours before joining his mother in death." A collective intake of breath swept through the hall. This revelation explained so much. The king's years of brooding solitude, his resistance to remarriage despite the council's pressure, the shadow that had darkened his reign. Yet questions multiplied like wildfire. How had this monumental event been kept secret? A royal birth, a royal death. These were matters of state that typically unfolded before witnesses, recorded in chronicles marked with ceremony. The queen's death was announced. An elderly lord muttered to his neighbor, "But nothing of a child." "Hushed up," came the whispered reply. "But why?" The king seemed to hear these murmurs, his jaw tightening. "I ordered all evidence destroyed, all witnesses sworn to secrecy upon pain of death. I could not bear the reminder of what I had lost." The kingdom knew of the queen's passing, but not that she died giving life to an heir who didn't survive her. His voice broke slightly on these last words, a crack in the royal facade that revealed the human grief beneath. Edmund stirred in the king's arms, making a small sound that drew Alden's attention back to the child. Something in his expression softened as he looked down at the infant's face. The nobles began to whisper more urgently among themselves, connecting pieces of a puzzle that had confounded them for years. The king's extended period of mourning, his retreat from public life, the abrupt dismissal of several long-serving members of the royal household. All now made sense in light of this revelation. But what did it mean for the peasant woman and her twins? Some courtiers studied Alara with new interest, reassessing her significance in this unfolding drama. Was she merely a convenient solution to the king's private grief, or something more? Lord Cedric stepped forward, breaking protocol in a way that demonstrated either great courage or foolhardy ambition. "Your Majesty," he said, his voice carefully modulated to project both sympathy and concern, "while the court deeply regrets your past sorrow, surely this arrangement cannot stand. A peasant child cannot replace a royal heir. The succession must be secured through proper channels, a new marriage, a legitimate prince." Several council members nodded in agreement, though they were careful to keep their expressions neutral. The Lord Chamberlain, ancient in his ceremonial robes, looked particularly troubled, his rheumy eyes darting between the king and the child in his arms. The king's response was measured but firm. "I did not say this child would replace my son or inherit my throne, Lord Cedric. I said I would not lose another child." He fixed Cedric with a stare that made the nobleman take an involuntary step backward. "Do not presume to interpret my words or intentions." Cedric bowed stiffly, effectively silenced but clearly not satisfied. The tension in his posture suggested this would not be the end of his resistance. Alara, who had remained silent during this exchange, now spoke again, her voice stronger than before. "Majesty, I grieve for your loss. Truly. But my grief is different. My son lives, yet I cannot hold him, cannot watch him grow, cannot be his mother in anything but blood." She took a deep breath. "I beg you, not as a subject to a king, but as one parent to another, let me have my child back." The raw emotion in her plea touched even some of the more cynical courtiers. A lady near the back of the hall dabbed at her eyes with an embroidered handkerchief. The master of horse, a gruff man with little patience for court intrigues, shifted uncomfortably, his weathered face softening at the mother's words. But the king seemed to tremble, as if physically shaken by Alara's request. Those closest to the throne could see his knuckles whitening as he tightened his hold on Edmund, not enough to harm the child, but enough to betray his visceral reluctance to relinquish him. "This child has brought me the first peace I have known in 5 years," he said, so quietly that many had to strain to hear. "When he cries, I remember what it is to comfort. When he sleeps in my chambers, I remember what it is to protect. When he grasps my finger with his tiny hand, I remember what it is to hope for tomorrow instead of dwelling in yesterday." The admission was startling in its vulnerability. King Alden, the warrior who had led armies and executed traitors with his own hand, was laying bare a wound that had festered in secret for years. "But what of my hope, Majesty?" Alara countered, emboldened perhaps by desperation. "What of my tomorrow? You have a kingdom to rule, subjects who depend on you. I have only my children. They are my kingdom, my legacy, my everything." Aldrich chose that moment to let out another cry, weaker than before. The pitiful sound cut through the hall like a knife, a stark reminder of the physical toll this separation was taking on both mother and child. The king looked at the ailing twin, then back at Edmund, seemingly healthier by the day in his care. The contrast could not have been more pronounced. One child thriving, one fading. Both born from the same womb on the same day, yet fate had already set them on diverging paths. In that moment, something shifted in the king's demeanor. A decision crystallized in his eyes, though none could guess its nature. He gestured to Lady Imogen, who approached the throne with visible trepidation. "Take Edmund," he instructed her. "Hold him while I speak with his mother." Lady Imogen carefully received the infant, who squirmed at the transfer but did not cry. The king then descended the steps of the dais, approaching Alara until they stood face to face, monarch and subject, man and woman, two parents bound by an impossible situation. "The court has heard part of my truth today," he said, his voice pitched for her ears alone. "But not all of it. There are deeper waters here than any suspect, currents that could sweep away the very foundations of the realm if known." He paused, studying her face with unnerving intensity. "What I ask now will determine the fate of both your sons. Consider carefully before you answer. Ilara met his gaze unflinchingly, though her heart hammered in her chest. Ask, Majesty. If I were to offer a compromise, one that would allow both twins to thrive, to grow strong, to know each other as brothers, but that would require sacrifice from you, would you accept it? What sacrifice? Ilara asked, suspicion warring with desperate hope in her voice. The king glanced back at the assembled court, then leaned closer to whisper in her ear. Whatever he said made her eyes widen, first in shock, then in something like understanding. When she drew back, her expression had transformed. Tears still shone in her eyes, but something else had taken root alongside her grief, a spark of possibility, perhaps even hope. I must consider, she said finally, loud enough for the front rows of courtiers to hear. This is no small matter you propose. The king nodded, then turned back to address the court. The matter will be resolved tomorrow, he announced. Until then, the woman and both her children will be given quarters in the East Wing. She is to be treated with respect and provided with whatever she requires. His gaze found Lord Cedric. Any objections? Cedric's jaw worked as if chewing on words he dared not speak aloud. Finally, he offered a stiff bow. None that cannot wait until tomorrow, Your Majesty. With that, the king signaled for the audience to end. As the nobles filed out, speculation already flying between them like arrows, one thing was certain. Tomorrow would bring changes none could fully predict. The king had revealed one secret, but his whispered words to Ilara suggested others remained hidden, secrets that might yet shake the very throne itself. Lady Imogen waited until the castle had settled into its nighttime rhythms before making her move. Torches burned low in their sconces, casting long shadows down the stone corridors. Guards stood at their posts, drowsy but vigilant. Servants had retreated to their quarters after the day's labors. The great hall, so alive with tension earlier, now lay empty and silent, moonlight streaming through high windows to illuminate the abandoned throne. This was the hour for secrets, and Lady Imogen was determined to uncover the one that lay at the heart of the king's strange behavior. She moved with practiced stealth through the corridors, her soft slippers making no sound on the stone floors. Decades at court had taught her every hidden passage, every servant's shortcut, every squeaking hinge to avoid. Tonight, she put that knowledge to use, slipping past guards who would have questioned her presence in this wing at such an hour. Her destination, the king's private study, adjacent to his sleeping chambers but separated from them by a heavy oak door. It was there that he kept his most personal documents, his private correspondence, items too intimate or sensitive for even his trusted secretary to handle. Lady Imogen knew she was risking everything. If discovered, the best she could hope for was banishment. The worst did not bear considering. Yet the revelation in the great hall had awakened something within her, a need to understand the full truth behind the king's grief and his strange attachment to the peasant's child. The study door was locked, of course, but Lady Imogen had prepared for this. From within the folds of her sleeve, she withdrew a slender iron key, a copy made years ago when she had briefly been the queen's most trusted lady-in-waiting, before illness and then childbirth had confined Eleonora to her chambers. In those days, Imogen had sometimes retrieved documents or personal items for the queen from this very room, always with the king's permission. The key slid into the lock with a soft scrape. Imogen held her breath as she turned it, wincing at the barely audible click that followed. She pushed the door open just enough to slip inside, then closed it carefully behind her. Moonlight filtered through the narrow windows, providing just enough illumination to navigate the space without a candle, which would have been too risky. The study was smaller than one might expect for a king, intimate almost, with a massive oak desk dominating the center, shelves of bound volumes lining one wall, and a comfortable chair beside the hearth where cold ashes lay undisturbed. Imogen moved first to the desk, carefully sliding open drawers and rifling through parchments with gentle fingers. Nothing unusual presented itself: trade agreements awaiting signature, reports from provincial governors, household accounts. She frowned, disappointed but not deterred. Next, she examined the shelves, running her fingers along the spines of books, looking for anything that might seem out of place. Again, nothing captured her attention. Histories, philosophical works, military treatises, the expected library of an educated monarch. Time was her enemy now. Each moment increased the risk of discovery. Imogen paused in the center of the room, considering her options. Where would a king hide his most closely guarded secrets? Her gaze fell on the cold hearth, or rather, on the ornate stone mantel above it. Unlike the rest of the room, which was functional if elegantly appointed, the mantel featured elaborate carvings of the royal crest flanked by mythical beasts. Acting on instinct, Imogen ran her fingers along the underside of the shelf, feeling for anything unusual. There, a small catch, nearly invisible unless one knew to look for it. She pressed it, and a section of the stone swung outward, revealing a cavity just large enough to hold a small box or package. Imogen reached inside, her fingers encountering smooth, polished wood. She withdrew a box roughly the size of both her hands together, plain and unadorned except for a simple iron clasp. No lock secured it. The hidden compartment itself was security enough. Her heart pounding, Imogen carried the box to the desk where the moonlight was strongest. She hesitated only briefly before lifting the lid. Inside lay a yellowed parchment, folded carefully and sealed with the royal insignia in faded wax. Beneath it rested a small bundle of cloth, stained dark in places. With trembling fingers, Imogen lifted the parchment first, breaking the seal as gently as possible. The letter within was written in a flowing, feminine hand that Imogen recognized immediately, Queen Eleanor's own script. It was dated 5 years ago, just before her death. My beloved husband, if you are reading this, I have left this world, perhaps taking our child with me. The physicians do not give me much hope, though I fight on for both our sakes. Should our son survive me, love him doubly, for himself and for me. Should he join me in death, know that my greatest regret is leaving you alone with your grief. But there is something you must know, something I have carried as a burden these past months. Our child may not be the only heir of your blood. During your campaign in the Northern Territories, when communication between us was severed for many weeks, a terrible thing occurred. Here the handwriting grew unsteady, as if the Queen had struggled to continue. I was attacked in the royal gardens one night by a man wearing your own guard's colors. He overpowered me before I could call for help. I have carried the shame of that night in silence, unable to bring myself to tell you upon your return, especially when I discovered I was with child. The physicians say the babe's timing aligns with your return, but in my heart I have feared, I have wondered. Is this child truly yours, or the product of violence? I take this secret to my grave, my love, but I leave you this warning. Should our son bear little resemblance to you as he grows, know there may be reason. And know that regardless of his true paternity, I have loved this child fiercely from the moment I felt him quicken within me. With eternal devotion, Eleanora. Imogen stared at the letter in shock, its implications unfurling in her mind like a poisonous flower. If the Queen had been violated, if the royal heir's parentage had been in question, no wonder the king had ordered all evidence of the child's existence erased after both mother and baby died. Such a scandal would have shaken the very foundations of the realm. But what connection did this have to the peasant woman and her twins? With growing urgency, Imogen set aside the letter and lifted the stained cloth bundle from the box. Carefully unwrapping it, she revealed a small golden bracelet sized for an infant's wrist. The royal crest was engraved upon a central medallion, but as Imogen turned it in the moonlight, she noticed something unusual, a small additional marking beneath the crest, a tiny emblem that looked like a flowering branch. This was no ordinary royal heirloom. This particular symbol had been the personal emblem of Queen Eleanor's family, used to distinguish her possessions from the general royal items. The bracelet had been made specifically for her child. As Imogen examined it more closely, she noticed dark stains on the cloth it had been wrapped in. Old blood, long dried, but never completely washed away. A relic of tragedy, preserved despite the king's orders to destroy all evidence of the child. The sound of a key in the outer door made Imogen freeze. Heart pounding, she hastily rewrapped the bracelet and returned it to the box along with the letter. She had barely managed to replace the box in its hiding place and push the panel closed when the door to the study swung open. A servant entered, carrying a candle that illuminated his startled face when he spotted Lady Imogen standing by the hearth. "My lady, what are you doing here at this hour?" Imogen summoned every ounce of aristocratic composure. "The king requested I retrieve a document for tomorrow's council meeting. He gave me his key." She held up the copy as if it were the genuine article. "I was just leaving." The servant bowed, though suspicion lingered in his eyes. "Shall I escort you back to your chambers, my lady?" "That won't be necessary," she replied smoothly, gliding past him toward the door. "Good night." Once safely away, Imogen leaned against a wall in a deserted corridor, her mind racing with the implications of what she had discovered. The Queen's letter raised more questions than it answered. If the royal heir's paternity had been uncertain, what did that mean for the succession, for the king's interest in Edmund? And there was still the matter of what the king had whispered to Alara in the great hall, a proposal that had clearly shaken the peasant woman to her core. By morning, the sensational discovery had spread through the castle like wildfire, though in fragmented, distorted forms. Some servants claimed the queen had borne twins, not a single child. Others insisted the king had fathered a bastard in the village years ago. Still others whispered that the peasant woman was somehow related to the royal family. A discarded mistress, perhaps, or a distant cousin fallen on hard times. The truth, as Lady Imogen now suspected, was likely both simpler and more complex than any of these rumors. But only two people knew it for certain: the king himself, and perhaps now, Alara. As nobles and servants alike gathered in the great hall the following morning, anticipation hung thick in the air. The king sat upon his throne, his expression inscrutable. Alara stood before him, both twins in her arms now. Edmund returned to her temporarily, it seemed, for this final audience. Lord Cedric and his faction had positioned themselves prominently, their faces masks of barely concealed hostility. Lady Imogen stood apart, watching everything with new understanding, wondering how much of what was about to unfold had been set in motion years ago by a tragedy kept hidden from the kingdom. The king raised his hand, and the hall fell silent. The moment of truth had arrived. Morning light streamed through the high stained glass windows of the great hall, casting jewel-toned patterns across the assembled court. The air hung heavy with anticipation, charged like the atmosphere before a summer storm. Not a whisper disturbed the silence as all eyes fixed upon the central tableau, the king upon his throne, and before him, Alara holding both her sons. The twins seemed to sense the gravity of the moment. Neither cried, their identical eyes, blue as a clear winter sky, wide open and alert. Edmund, having thrived under royal care, looked noticeably healthier than his brother. Yet seeing them together, none could deny they were two halves of a whole, mirror images created from the same flesh and blood. King Alden studied them, his gaze moving from one infant face to the other with an intensity that made even the most hardened courtiers shift uncomfortably. Something profound and private played across his features: grief, longing, resolve, each emotion chasing the other like clouds across a windswept sky. When he finally spoke, his voice carried to every corner of the hushed hall. "I have spent the night in contemplation," he began, "weighing what is right against what is easy, what is just against what is expedient." He paused, his fingers tightening almost imperceptibly on the carved arms of his throne. "And I have reached a decision regarding these children and their mother." Lord Cedric stepped forward, breaking protocol with calculated insolence. "Your Majesty, before you pronounce judgment, the Council feels it necessary to express concerns regarding this unprecedented situation." His voice dripped with false deference. "While your compassion does you credit, certain considerations of state must take precedence over personal." Silence. The king did not shout, yet the single word cut through Cedric's speech like a blade. "You were not given permission to address the throne, Lord Cedric. Step back or be removed." Two royal guards moved forward, hands on sword hilts. Cedric's face flushed crimson, but he retreated, the momentary humiliation clearly stored away for future retribution. The king returned his attention to Alara, his expression softening slightly. "Come closer," he commanded. She approached the dais, her simple dress, cleaner now after a night in the castle but still patched and worn, a stark contrast to the opulence surrounding her. Yet she carried herself with unexpected dignity, her chin lifted, her gaze steady. Whatever fear she felt remained carefully contained. King Alden rose from his throne and descended the 3 shallow steps until he stood on equal footing with her. The move was symbolic, unprecedented. Kings did not leave their thrones to stand eye to eye with peasants. A collective intake of breath swept through the assembly. "Yesterday," he said, his voice now pitched for all to hear, "this woman came to reclaim what is hers by right of blood and birth. A mother seeking her child. A simple matter, one might think." His eyes scanned the crowd, challenging anyone to interject. Yet nothing about this situation is simple. He moved closer, studying the twins with undisguised fascination. Edmund, recognizing the king who had held him these past weeks, reached out a tiny hand. Without hesitation, Alden offered his finger, which the infant grasped with surprising strength. "Look at them," he continued, addressing the court rather than Alara now. "2 brothers, born as one, divided by circumstances beyond their control. One thriving in plenty, one fading in poverty. Is this justice? Is this the order a king should maintain in his realm?" None dared answer the rhetorical question. Lady Imogen watched from her position near the royal dais, her newfound knowledge lending deeper meaning to the king's words. She alone among the courtiers suspected what might come next. "I have lost a son," Alden said, returning to the revelation that had shocked the court the previous day. "That wound will never fully heal. But in these past weeks, caring for this child," he nodded toward Edmund, "I have remembered what it means to look toward the future rather than dwell in the past." He turned back to face Alara directly. "You came here prepared to sacrifice your own happiness, to leave with only one son rather than see both suffer. That courage humbles me." For the briefest moment, the king of the realm bowed his head to the peasant woman, another unprecedented gesture that sent murmurs rippling through the crowd. "But I will not force that choice upon you," he declared. "Nor will I keep what is not mine to take." The king reached out, gently running his fingertips over first Edmund's head, then Aldrich's, in a gesture almost like a blessing. Then, to the astonishment of everyone present, he stepped back and made his pronouncement. "Both children will remain together, as brothers should, but neither in poverty nor separated from their mother." His voice took on the formal cadence used for royal decrees. "From this day forward, Alara and her children, all of her children, will reside within the castle walls. The twins will be raised together, with all the advantages my position can provide, but under their mother's care and guidance." The great hall erupted in shocked whispers. Such an arrangement was unheard of. A commoner family living within the royal household, peasant children raised alongside noble offspring. It upended every convention of the rigid social order that governed their world. Lord Cedric could contain himself no longer. "This is outrageous," he exclaimed, his face mottled with fury. "You would elevate a peasant and her brood to the royal household? What next? Will you name these commoner brats as your heirs?" Several other nobles murmured agreement, their expressions ranging from confusion to outright hostility. The king's decision threatened not just tradition but the very power structure that kept them elevated above the masses. King Alden turned to face this challenge, his expression hardening. "I have not finished, Lord Cedric. Perhaps if you exercised patience alongside your abundant ambition, you would hear the full measure of my decree." Chastened but not cowed, Cedric fell silent, hatred simmering in his eyes. "I do not elevate them blindly," the king continued. "Alara will serve as royal nursemaid, a position that grants her residence within the castle while maintaining appropriate distinction of rank." His gaze swept the assembly, daring further objection. "As for the children, they will be educated according to their abilities and future roles in service to the crown. Nothing more, nothing less." It was a masterful compromise, practical, difficult to openly challenge, yet still revolutionary in its way. The king had found a path that kept the twins together, and their mother with them, all while preserving the essential hierarchies that his nobles so jealously guarded. Alara herself appeared stunned. The previous night's private conversation with the king had prepared her for something, but perhaps not the public nature of this declaration, nor its elegance in satisfying multiple concerns simultaneously. "Your Majesty," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how to thank you." "There is no need," he replied, loud enough for those nearest to hear. "A mother should not have to choose between her children. No parent should." For an instant, raw grief flickered across his features before being carefully masked once more. He turned back to address the full court. "Let it be known throughout the kingdom that from this day forward, no mother shall be forced to surrender a child due to poverty alone. Royal funds will establish orphanages in every province, and aid will be distributed to widows with children, particularly those whose husbands died in service to the crown." This broader policy announcement caught even his advisors by surprise. The Lord Treasurer visibly paled, no doubt already calculating the cost to the royal coffers. Yet none could openly object to such a benevolent initiative without appearing monstrous. The king was not finished. He approached Ilara again, standing close enough that his next words were meant primarily for her, though those nearby could still hear. "Your sons will grow together, neither privileged nor deprived. They will know who they are and where they come from. And perhaps," he glanced down at the twins, something unreadable passing across his face, "perhaps they will help heal old wounds, theirs, yours, and even mine." With that enigmatic statement, he stepped back and raised his voice once more to address the entire assembly. "This matter is concluded. Return to your duties." As the crowd began to disperse, a remarkable thing happened. The elderly nursemaid who had cared for Queen Eleonora during her confinement, and who was one of the few who knew the full truth of that tragic time, approached the throne. She sank to her knees before the king, tears streaming down her wrinkled face. "At last," she whispered, her voice cracking with emotion. "At last, Your Majesty, you begin to live again." In that moment, something shifted in the atmosphere of the great hall, and perhaps in the kingdom itself. Servants exchanged glances of cautious hope. Several ladies of the court discreetly dabbed at moist eyes. Even a few of the more compassionate lords nodded in grudging approval. Only Lord Cedric and his faction maintained their stony disapproval, already plotting how this disruption to the natural order might be turned to their advantage. As Ilara stood holding her reunited sons, no longer forced to make an impossible choice between them, she marveled at the strange turns of fate that had brought her to this moment. From desperate poverty to the royal household in the span of a month, it seemed more the stuff of minstrels' tales than real life. And as the king looked upon the small family that would now become part of his household, something long frozen within him began to thaw. Not replacement for what was lost. Nothing could ever replace his son or his queen, but perhaps a new purpose, a way to honor their memory by extending compassion where once he had known only bitterness. In the voice of the court chronicler who would later record these events for posterity, "Thus did grief and mercy together forge a new beginning, proving that the true power of a crown lies not in gold or force of arms, but in the courage to love despite loss and to find strength in healing rather than vengeance." What would you have done in Ilara's place? Faced with an impossible choice between watching both your children slowly starve or giving one away in hopes they might survive, could you have found the courage she did? Sometimes the most profound love expresses itself not in what we keep close, but in what we're willing to let go. And what of King Alden, a man whose grief had hardened his heart, until a mother's sacrifice awakened something he thought forever lost? His journey reminds us that healing rarely comes from where we expect it, and that the deepest wounds can sometimes be mended by the most unlikely encounters. Perhaps true strength lies not in never falling, but in how we rise again after life has broken us. This tale of sacrifice, unexpected compassion, and the bonds that transcend social divisions invites us to examine our own lives. Where might we be holding too tightly to pain? Where could unexpected mercy change everything? If you found meaning in this story, please share it with someone who might need its message today. Subscribe to see more tales that illuminate the darkest corners of the human heart, and remind us that even in our most desperate hours, hope can find its way through the smallest cracks in our defenses.